What I remember was violently resisting, all of us, different ways, the idea that the university could be in loco parentis, as it wanted to call itself. The university would play the role of your parents. And if you had a beef against another student of any kind, it was considered kind of babyish to want to go to the dean the entire time and complain about your feelings. But now it seems to me that not just on sexual matters, but on quite a lot of other things lumped under the heading of correctitude, everyone in the university seems to want to have more authority over themselves, to have more complaints procedures, to have more therapy and more litigation. And I would say, for heaven's sake, there's enough of all that in the wider society as it is. And you can't justify this by reference to microorganisms, I'm sorry to say. It's not viruses that are making people behave this way. It's a regression to infantilism.
Or then there's postmodernism. Oh, I know, yes, it's a book review of a wonderful book by Sowell and Breakmore. Sowell was the physicist who did that splendid spoof article which fooled all the postmodernists and it left them with egg on their face. The feminist philosopher Luce Irigaray is another who is given whole chapter treatment by Sowell and Breakmore. In a passage reminiscent of a notorious feminist description of Newton's Principia as a rape manual. Newton's Principia is a rape manual. Irigaray argues that E equals mc squared is a sexed equation. Why? Because it privileges the speed of light. Privileges is one of their favorite words, I dare say you've noticed. It privileges the speed of light over other speeds that are vitally necessary to Just as typical of the school of thought under examination is Irigaray's thesis on fluid mechanics. Fluids, you see, have been unfairly neglected. Masculine physics privileges rigid, solid things.
Multiculturalism is an insistence that the particular cultures found among less fortunate groups are not to be blamed for disparities in income or education or crime rates, but are on net positive.
Yes.
Close quote. Explain that.
You can't find any fault with any group that is less fortunate. There are no behaviors that they need to change in order to advance. Society needs to accept them as they are. In other words, the causes are to remain the same, but the effects are to change. And if the effects don't change, then it's society's fault.
Among advocates of multiculturalism became diversity.
Yes.
Sweeping claims for the benefits of demographic and cultural diversity have prevailed without a speck of evidence being asked for or given. Name a few institutions in which diversity is championed without evidence.
Gosh, the question would be, name one way where that isn't the case. I would say the whole Ivy League, Stanford, Berkeley.
Corporate America?
Yes. It's really miraculous almost. I mean, I can't think of a word that has gained such widespread use and which is utterly unchallenged without one speck of evidence.
Academy has been invaded by a new form of study. It used to be the case that at universities you were teaching a recognized subject with a recognized curriculum, and you were carrying out research or scholarship in the humanities, which was open-minded, guided by the pursuit of truth, and not dismayed, particularly if it came to surprising or unorthodox conclusions. Now, one of the first things that happens when a totalitarian government takes over is that the universities are cleaned up. As I say, people who are doing that kind of thing get thrown out. This is what happened when the Nazis took over the German universities and when the Soviets took over, the communists took over the Russian universities. But on the whole, this is the first move that the totalitarian mentality makes to stop that kind of free-minded, open scholarship in pursuit of truth. But so we have been lucky in inheriting universities of that kind. But is it the case that we still have them? We have seen the growth of an extraordinary number of new subjects in the university in which the pursuit of truth seems to be secondary to something else. The other thing being the pursuit of some kind of political conformity. If you take a subject like women's studies, now I know this is a controversial issue, but perhaps it can be talked about freely in this room. You can't talk about it freely in America, on the whole. Anyway, there is a subject. It's very difficult to imagine that you would succeed in that subject if you didn't have, either at the outset or certainly in the conclusion, feminist opinions. And there is it's a subject constructed around an ideology. It might be that this ideology is grounded in truth, who knows? But to question it is something which is essentially made impossible both by the curriculum and by the way of teaching it.
I can. So there's definitely a consensus within the field. We know that these sex differences exist. We know that there are biological sex differences in the brain that are not due to socialization. This is due to exposure to prenatal testosterone in the womb. The reason why you don't see so many people saying that publicly is because it's considered politically incorrect. So the only, quote unquote experts that you'll see are people who are touting this accepted narrative that any sex differences we see are socialized, or that there are no differences between men and women. People like to hear that stuff, so that's why we see most of that being promoted in media. But definitely within the field, people know that you can't say these things publicly in terms of sex differences because there's going to be public backlash.
In women's studies is the failure to have a requirement about biology.
Oh, well,
there's no reference to biology. You've had now 40 years of women's studies, right, with the social constructionist view of gender, okay, without the slightest reference to hormones or endocrinology or anything else.
40 years of women's studies, and I think we know less about gender than we did when they started, for this very reason. This dogma, that men and women are the same, that we're cognitively interchangeable.
We're blank slates at birth, and
yes.
Society inscribes gender on us.
Yes.
It's absurd.
Yes, there's one.
Yeah. I mean, for heaven's sakes, I'm someone who was writing a dissertation on androgyny, okay, and I never, for one moment in my entire life, have questioned that the sexes are actually different, and that there is a very powerful hormonal compulsion that drives the sexes together for procreation. Hello, okay.
And it's so obvious. And people say, well, what's the evidence? Well, let's start with the entire anthropological record, or just go into just look at a magazine rack, and it's clear that men are looking, on average, I'm not talking about all men and all women, but on average, there are different propensities.
Men have 8 to 10 times the amount of testosterone, okay, circulating in their bodies than women do.
They are, anytime they find statistical disparity between men and women in any field, if there are more male, petroleum engineers, it has to be discrimination.
Right. It can't be women's free choice for any reason.
Free choice, and that on average, women are interested in other things.
Absolutely. And what this did to create English women's studies department, absolutely out of the air, just snap your fingers and create women's studies. The English department had taken a century to develop. Okay, it was a huge argument. Okay, within it, right? And all of a sudden, to create a department with a politicized agenda from the start, okay, by people without any training, whatever, in that field. Okay, what should be the parameters of the field? What should be the requirements of that field? How about biology? Okay, if you're going to be discussing gender, that should have been a #1 requirement. Okay, as part of any women's studies department or program. Yes. But no. Okay, it was all hands off. It was just the administrators wanted to solve a public relations problem. Okay, they had a situation with very few women faculty nationwide at a time when the women's movement had just started up. The spotlight of attention was on them. They needed women faculty fast. They needed the women's subject on the agenda fast, right? So they just poof, let there be women's studies, okay? And now we'll just hire some women, usually from English departments, here and there, and we'll just throw them together. You invent it. You say what it is. So that's why women's studies got frozen at a certain point of ideology.
You have a BA and MA in English. You have a JD. You're a lawyer. But you're a scholar in so many areas. Race relations, immigration, policing, and colleges and universities, and this is where I really wanted to delve in with you. You have a brand new book, The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. This is so relevant today. And you argue that toxic ideas first spread by higher education have undermined humanistic values, fueled intolerance, and widened divisions in our larger culture. And I think we see this everywhere.
The preposterous mantra to believe survivors, regardless of the evidence, regardless of due process. This is the campus rape hysteria that has been transforming the lives of males on campuses, creating an extraordinarily costly bureaucracy, moved into the real world, and it's not going away. It's only going to get worse.
Sort of a Soviet-style system where there really isn't free speech. You're not allowed to challenge the so-called norms in the universities, where race and gender seem to have a priority over other things and that sort of thing. When did all this happen?
Well, the 80s was when it started, in my view. That's when you got radical multiculturalism that hit. And students were given a license for ignorance. They were taught that the only thing they needed to know about a book was the race and gender of the author, to know whether it was thoroughly dismissible without even being read, and they could go on to instead wallow in their own delusional oppression. And it has only gotten worse since then. And what we are doing is breeding the grounds for, I fear, civil war, because students are being taught to hate the greatest works of Western civilization, and frankly, to hate each other. From the moment a student steps on college campus today as a freshman, or a fresh person, I should probably say, the bureaucracy is determined to drum into that student's head identity politics, which says he's either a victim or an oppressor. Now is almost an expectation that if you're a minority student on campus, you're there to protest.
Eventually, the protesters took over the stage. From UCLA, MacDonald went to Claremont College. There, she was met with posters saying, "Shut down anti-black fascist Heather MacDonald."
This is preposterous. I have spent enormous amount of time in high-crime minority neighborhoods talking to the good people there who are desperate for more police, who have a right to expect the same freedom from fear as people in safer neighborhoods take for granted. My agenda is to try to give voice to these people. To say that I'm anti-black is ridiculous.
Nevertheless, activists for
coddling of the American mind, how good intentions and bad ideas are set up a generation for failure.
There are two related problems that have sort of flooded into the United States or become very visible in the last 3 or 4 years. They weren't really visible before then. So I'll just very briefly state them, and that I hope will set us up for a discussion. The first is that we have, I'd say, a mental health crisis for boys and a mental health catastrophe for girls. What I mean by that is that rates of anxiety and depression were fairly stable in the from 2000 to 2010, and then they begin rising very sharply. For boys, rates of major depression are up about 30%. For girls, they're up about 40%. Some people say this is just self-report, it's not real. But rates of hospital admission for self-harm are up in the same way for girls, not for boys though. For suicide in the United States, suicide for teenage boys is up 25% from the first decade of the century if you look at the rise to the last 2 or 3 years. 25% increase. For girls, it's 70%, 70% increase. I just looked at the numbers for the UK on my way over here. The Guardian has had a lot of really good coverage of the various studies that have come out. It's the exact same thing. You too have no rise at all in hospital admissions for boys. Boys are not cutting themselves more, but your girls are going to the hospital much more because they cut their bodies and are bleeding. You also have, even though the suicide rate, I think it was in England and Wales, even though that suicide rate is going down to historic levels overall, the rate for teenage girls has reached its highest level ever. You also have about a 60 or 65% increase in completed suicides for English girls, English and Welsh girls. So there's a mental health catastrophe going on. We don't really know what causes it, but the most likely explanations are the combination of social media, which is much harder on girls than boys, and the vast overprotection that we in the United States we decided to stop letting our kids out, to tell them the world is dangerous, to tell them that if they're ever not watched by an adult, they will be abducted. We started telling them this in the 1980s and especially in the 1990s, just as our crime rate was plummeting. We taught them that life is so dangerous that they shouldn't be allowed outside. We deprived them of free play. So we don't know for sure, but we have a mental health crisis. It begins with kids born in 1995.
When did this start? When did the trigger warnings? When did the safe spaces? When did all this emerge?
Well, it has its roots in the student radicalism of the 1960s, especially the far left radicalism. It really popped up in the 1990s, in the early 90s, especially in the early part of the 90s. But it got pushed back down and disappeared and went underground. It went underground is more accurate. And then it's just come back with a vengeance in the last 5 years. And I think it's partly because we have all these radical left political activist departments at the universities, women's studies being at the top of the list, that have done nothing for the last 30 years. It's even longer than that now. It's almost 40 years, 30 years, let's say, have done nothing but produce a never-ending stream of ideologically minded counter-civilization political activists. And that's all subsidized by tuition and by the public purse. And that's another thing we really got to ask ourselves, is why the hell are we subsidizing revolution? Why are we doing that? It's crazy. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous.
So what exactly is going on with women's studies that you believe is fostering revolution?
Well, you go on their websites and read what they say. I mean, first of all, for the women's studies types, and this is, what would you call it, false anthropology. There's this idea that way back when there was a feminist paradise, and that would be like noble savage mode of living where everything was egalitarian and women dominated. It was a matriarchal culture. And that was put forward by a UCLA anthropologist named Gembutes. I can never pronounce her name properly, but I think I got it. And then that was overthrown by patriarchal institutions, essentially starting at about the time, say, of Judaism. And that was all overthrown, and ever since then we've lived in an oppressive patriarchy. And that's what our culture is. It's an oppressive patriarchy.
So they're pointing to one unsuccessful society that they believe existed, or did it actually exist?
No, it didn't exist. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. It's complicated, but it's the telling of a kind of psychological myth as if it was history.
Whoa.
And anyway, so the basic claim is that Western civilization is a brutish patriarchy, and that whatever positive things it might have managed to accomplish were all accomplished as a consequence of oppression and theft, and that the appropriate thing to do is to restructure it from the bottom up. And they mean that. They mean that. They mean every single bloody concept. And you can marry that with modern postmodernism and throw in a nice dash of Marxism, and you have the ideological and motivated grounds for social revolution. And just go online and look at a dozen women's studies websites. Just read them. You can see what they say. They produce political activists, and their goal is to restructure the patriarchy. Well, what's the patriarchy? Well, the patriarchy is Western civilization. And what does restructure mean? That's easy. It means tear it down and destroy it. Why? Because it's a brutish system that's predicated on nothing but oppression. It's nothing but a tyranny in the eyes of the radical women's studies types. Heterosexuality, that's a tyranny. Capitalism, that's a tyranny. Democracy, well, that doesn't even exist, and even if it did, it would be a tyranny. Everything's a tyranny. And so you can ask these, and what would they replace it with? They replace it with their own ideological utopia. Well, we've already had 100 years of that. We saw what happened. Oh, well, that doesn't matter. That wasn't real Marxism. That's what the bloody Marxists always say. That wasn't real Marxism. It's like, oh, how many millions of people have to die before you're convinced that it's real Marxism?
This is where we are at today, not because of the rhetoric of Donald Trump, but because we have convinced our children, and indeed society as a whole, that when someone doesn't think exactly as you want or live in accordance to the solemn doctrine of the left, that they are now enemies of the state and subject to violence.
Well, as you can see, the opponents of free speech are capable of making a lot of inarticulate noise. And it's partly because of the videos that I've made. But also because reason I'm defending freedom of speech, because that's how people with different opinions settle their opinions in a civil society. And if we lose Now here's what's happened with Bill C-16 and the surrounding legislation. Free speech is the mechanism by which we keep our society functioning. It's as a consequence of free speech and the ability to speak that people can put their finger on problems, articulate what those problems are, solve them, and come to a consensus. And we risk losing that. Now, you can say there should be reasonable restrictions on free speech, and that's the case. You shouldn't be allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater. And reasonable people can discuss and debate what those restrictions should be. But we can't debate the fact that putting restrictions on free speech is something dangerous beyond comprehension. And that's what we're faced with. But it seems to me that we're in danger of crossing a line. With Bill C-16 and its surrounding legislation, it's the first time I've seen in our legislative history where people are attempting to make us speak their language. And that's not gonna happen. That's not something that I'm willing to do. Now, the radical left activists are trying to turn this into an argument about sexual politics. And it's only nominally about sexual politics. It's about language that's designed to control our freedom of expression.